Now when it comes to the world of Moto, there are tons of upgrade options for you to get your bike set up the way that you want to. One of the most overlooked upgrades you can make that also proves to be the most beneficial is getting your suspension done. Now the reason this is so neglected and overlooked is oftentimes because you can mod these bikes with a ton of power, and everybody loves the feeling of power. They love having the fastest bike on the block. However, all of that power means nothing if there's no performance aspects to back that in these bikes, and that can actually make these bikes become extremely dangerous. Now, over the years of riding as a professional athlete and testing just about every electric moto on the market that's worth testing here at Charge Cycle Works, we've come up with an upgrade path that really proves to be beneficial for where you put your money to make sure you get the most value out of what you're spending. The starting point is always going to be your cockpit. Now these are your touch points. This is where your hands physically touch, where your feet physically touch. You want to make sure that those points are all set up and proper for you. Now depending on how tall you are or your riding style, no one person is the same, but there are a lot of different tips and tricks that we can get into about how to get that set up properly. But the biggest thing is just finding a good bar bend that you're comfortable with, getting the ride height of those handlebars in a good spot, usually through a direct mount stem, making sure that your brake levers are in a good position, as well as getting good foot pegs. Those are crucial on these e-motos because a lot of these bikes come with very cheap foot pegs that are very slippery at really bad times. You want to make sure that you can squeeze your bike and feel really good in that sense. From that point, we always go into wheels and tires. Wheels and tires is huge. It's very beneficial. This is your direct contact point to the ground, so you want to make sure you've got that right. And doing different styles of wheels also tends to set the pitch angle of a bike as well. Most of these bikes come with 19 wheels, or 18 in the rear, 19 in the front. These are not very good sizes, especially not for tire options in the future. Depending on the riding style that you have, they might be okay, especially if you're a street rider. Doing 19 is pretty good, but oftentimes street riders would like to go to supermoto setups, smaller wheels, better tire options if you go to a 14-inch wheel set, for example. An off-road rider, typically on the small-sized e-motos, going to a 16-19 wheel setup is the best because there's tons of tire options for you there. And then if you're on a mid-size or wanting your bike to be bigger overall, doing an 18-21 setup can also be very beneficial. It is a little bit more trickier to find tires for the smaller bikes. You have to go with more of like a vintage style Dunlop MX-33 or tires along those lines that are a lot thinner to fit in these swing arms. However, the mid-size and full-size bikes, no problem typically finding tires that fit those wheels great and fit within the chassis fine. Once you've done your cockpit and you've done your wheels, we often see people go for power, or even go for power straight off the bat and bypass those first two steps. This is not something that I would recommend doing because the number one most beneficial thing that you can do for your bike is going to be suspension. Now you want to keep in mind when it comes to upgrading suspension, do you want to have power in the future? If so, I would probably spring the bike to be a little bit heavier than what you would normally expect, especially if you're going to be going into that power later on, because anytime that you add power to a bike, it will make the bike heavier. Power typically comes in weight because there's a lot of things you have to do to be able to disperse the heat that comes with higher power levels coming out of these machines. Usually people get a bigger battery. A bigger battery is a majority of the weight by far, but then they'll do a controller. Those controllers usually have better heat dissipation, and that comes with more weight. And then the same thing with a motor. If you do a motor as well, then those motors are typically heavier in the aftermarket. However, that weight doesn't really matter because of the amount of power that you get out of it. The bike still feels lightweight while you're riding, but that power is so irrelevant if you do not have good suspension on your bike to begin with. It is so crucial to make sure that you have a good suspension setup because this is what truly defines how your bike will perform and handle in any situation or any terrain that you're in. So to repeat that process, our step-by-step plan is going to be doing the cockpit, doing your wheels, doing suspension, and then doing power. Now I want to focus a majority of this video mainly on suspension setup because this is what's so crucial and what's so overlooked, And it is one of the more daunting tasks to try to get a good suspension setup on your bike. Now, even if you don't plan on spending any money and you are just going to ride your bike bone stock as it is, still getting your suspension set up properly is very, very important, and it will go a really long way in making sure that your bike performs better, lasts longer. Suspension is so crucial in so many aspects, and it also prevents you from breaking things on these bikes too, which is pretty crucial because then you're not spending any unnecessary money trying to fix problems that could have been prevented from having the suspension working properly in the first place. So let's dive into the actual setup of your suspension, starting with the rear end of your bike. Now the bike behind me is an eRide Pro 3.0. This is the bike that I'm getting ready to go out and personally test because it has got a full EXT suspension setup in both the rear and the front. This is a new setup for this bike, and so I'm going to guide you guys through the process that I will be going through to try to find baseline settings that work great for me in the terrain that I'll be riding in. But this all starts with the actual installation of the suspension. So I'm not going to dive into showing you guys how to actually install the suspension onto this bike. However, all of these e-motos are very, very similar, but there's something that's super crucial that you need to do while installing that, and that is make sure that within your linkage, the actual bearings within that linkage are completely greased. From the manufacturer, they do not grease these very good, and this goes across every single manufacturer, including actual gas dirt bikes. Japanese and European manufacturers, they also do not put anything more than assembly grease into the bearings of the linkage systems on these bikes. So you want to actually take apart that linkage, properly grease it, and then put it all back together. That is such an important step in ensuring that your suspension is going to be working well on the back end. And then from that point, once you've actually got it installed, setting the sag is a major determining factor of how this bike's going to sit and how it's going to ride and perform. If you don't know what sag is, there are tons of videos going over sag, but it's essentially how much the bike sags or sits in the travel with your body weight on the bike in full riding gear. You typically want to be around the 25 to 35% mark. Somewhere within there is going to be a good setting for you to start with. So I always start by sagging the bike to 30%. Now that defines the pitch angle of the rear end, how high it sits and how low it sits. I'll dive into balance a little bit later on, but to get a rear end set up, definitely go through the linkage and then dive into sag and make sure you're somewhere within that 25 to 35% zone. Setting it right in the middle gives you quite a bit of adjustability, either higher or lower, and this also helps you determine if you're within the right spring rate for your body weight. Far too often do I see people overspring the suspension because they think that's what makes it stiffer, but all you're really doing is actually making the dampening not perform properly. Typically stiffness will come more through dampening than it will an actual spring rate. Yes, obviously you're going to feel something stiffer if you have a higher spring rate, but your dampening is not going to work properly, which means even though the initial stroke might be a little bit stiffer, the rest of it is not going to function well, and it's actually going to become overreactive. So to determine if you have the right spring rate, for me, when I set this sag up to that 30% mark, I base it off of how many preload turns it takes to get to that mark. Right now, I am perfectly set at 30%, and I've got 2 turns of preload on this when I'm fully in gear. That's a great place to be because the more preload that you add to a shock, the more things kind of start to get bound. So your goal is to get the bike balanced properly in the rear end with as minimal preload as possible. If you are able to accomplish this pretty well, then you are definitely within the right spring rate. Now, if I were to go and add 7, 8 turns onto this shock, my spring rate is totally wrong for my body weight. I would have to go up and stiffen that spring rate and make sure that it's in a much better place. So you might be thinking, well, Brett, I was able to accomplish my sag, like you said, at the 30% mark with 7 turns of preload. Why is this a problem? Well, that's because your static ride height, which is what setting sag is, stationary on the ground, versus your dynamic ride height are drastically different at that point. So if my static ride height is correct, but I've got a ton of preload on my spring, that is tension on that spring that is wanting to fight its way back to rebounding, right? So you might think, oh, I've got a bunch of tension, it's fighting its way back. If I slow down my rebound, then it's going to ride in a better height. In all reality, it's not. What is going to happen is, and a great example of this is if I'm coming into a corner and I'm braking heavily and I've got a lot of preload in my spring, it is going to throw an excessive amount of force into topping out or raising the rear end of my bike under braking load into a corner. So this is going to put way too much weight on my front end, and it's going to make me feel like I'm actually having issues in my front end, whereas the real problem is my bike is not balanced and tracking well dynamically coming into a corner. That's why getting the right spring rate is so crucial. It's way less to do with stiffness and way more to do with where your dynamic ride height and balance of the bike is in the rear end. So having the least amount of preload, like I mentioned, in your shock is going to help your spring not be bound, which means when you do finally achieve the balance of your bike front to rear end, you will be able to utilize your dampening and your rebound circuits to be able to maintain the bumps that you are feeling while you're riding. Now let's dive into the setup of the front end of the bike, and bear with me here guys, because getting the front end of your bike set up properly can be quite complicated. There's a lot of variables to it, but just follow along. I'll get you guys through it. So first things first, and a big reason why I chose the E-Ride Pro to be my example bike today is not only that I'm getting ready to go and actually test this bike for myself with this suspension setup. The E-Ride Pro is a platform that has got so many different variables when it comes to the aftermarket that you can really make great changes or horrible changes depending on what you do to set it up. A big change, like I mentioned earlier, is doing a wheel set. If you're an off-road rider, doing 16-19 wheels is typically the best way to go. A big thing that does though is it does lower the rear end of the bike, and a reason why I say that is a good move on a bike like this is because the actual geometry and steering angle of these bikes typically works a little bit better if you slack it out a little bit. Right now the bike is sitting a bit pitched forward, which for street riding actually works pretty darn well. You get a lot of traction in your front end, but for off-road riding, that comes at the cost of quite a few different things, especially when you're trying to hold traction on dirt, maybe going through bumps into a corner or anything like that. So typically in the off-road scene, slacking out one of these bikes specifically helps quite a bit. This also is the same way for a lot of different brands when it comes to these small size e-motos like Telerias or a multitude of other brands that typically are tested on the streets more than they are off-road, and their front end is a little bit low. So for me, going into this test, I did not want to change the wheel set on it yet. I want to begin my testing process with seeing what I can do to accomplish good balance out of this bike with the stock wheels, just in case that's a route you guys are after, not wanting to spend money on wheels but understand the value of suspension. That's why I'm beginning testing on the stock wheels that come on this bike. Because I am testing on this platform, I opted for a drop crown on this fork. That gives me roughly another inch of adjustability within my front fork. And because this front end sits a little bit too low balance-wise, I am able to use that drop crown to pull the fork down, which therefore raises the front end of my bike, creating a much better balance, or at least creating much more adjustability room for me to balance this bike when I'm actually out there riding. That's why I opted for the drop crown right off the bat, is to be able to have that adjustability for when I actually get out and test it. Now let's go all the way back to the actual installation of the fork, because these steps are crucial to get the fork to the point where I actually can test it. So like I mentioned, I opted for a drop crown, but before I even went and installed this fork, I had to take apart the front end. So if you are not upgrading your fork, please take apart the front end, grease these bearings. Same thing like I mentioned on the rear end, you want to get quite a bit of grease on the bearings within this headset. The manufacturer grease on all of these bikes is not good. Clean that grease out, put in real grease. I've got quite a few videos already showing you how to do this, so just dive into the channel, you'll see those videos. In the meantime, grease that headset. Next thing that I do is when I put the front end back together, I will determine the actual tension of the headset. So you can see right now, if I bump this, the fork actually stays true instead of just whipping to the other side with a little bit of force. So that means that my actual tension on this headset is quite stiff. Now that's a personal preference. I like my tension to be quite a bit stiff for a multitude of reasons. One is tracking through ruts or rough terrain. I'm able to relax my arms quite a bit because the bike's not going to want to get out of control. It actually takes some force to be able to move that front end, which is good for me because at the end of a long day of riding or the end of a 30-minute plus moto, I want the bike to be doing more work than I am. We all know how tiring it can be to be out there on a bike. Getting the bike to do the work for you goes a really long way, lets you relax, lets you push harder in the end. So that's one big benefit to having a stiffer front end. It's going to feel really weird at first. If you put quite a bit of tension on your headset, the bike is going to feel very dead on the front end. And this is something that takes some time to get used to, but you ride it for 30 minutes, you'll realize the benefits that come along with it. And in my opinion, it's much, much better to be this way than it is to be loose in any sense. Let's say you're riding trails, you hit a rock or you hit a root, it's not going to just deflect and kick away from you. It's going to actually kind of take that, and it's going to be easy to manage and pull that back true. Whereas if it's loose, it's going to deflect off things really quickly. Same thing for sand riding. Sand riding, it's so easy to dive your front end into sand, get it caught up, and then it can tuck on you. Whereas if it's stiffer, it's much better at just staying true, staying on track. You're having to use less input into the handlebars. I like having a stiffer front end in pretty much every scenario that I have ever ridden, whether that's motocross, track. If you're a freestyle rider, let's say you jump in the air, you let go of the bars doing any sort of trick, the front end will once again stay true, which is super nice. You don't have to worry about it going sideways and trying to find your handlebars again. It's just right where you want it to be. There's a ton of benefits to having a stiffer headset, which is the reason that I run that. Once again, personal preference. Definitely try it at some point. If you don't like it, go back to your normal riding style, but please try to take the time to actually get used to it, to notice those benefits if you do end up stiffening your headset. Now, the next step that I typically take is no matter what ride height I set the fork to, which this will come when you're actually riding the bike and feeling the balance, so we'll get into that later, but no matter what height you set that fork at, make sure both sides are perfectly in alignment. This is so crucial. You have to nail that height, because a major benefit of having that in the right place is you don't bind the fork legs or the axle. All of that is perfectly in alignment so that when you hit a rock, things won't be kind of trying to fight or forces won't be twisting on each other. There's a lot of flex that goes through forks, especially on these smaller e-moto bikes. So having that alignment dissipates a lot of that flex, keeps things in alignment, makes the top subtle bumps that you hit be a lot softer and a lot more manageable so that you don't get this chatter in your hands after riding for a long time. So making sure that you have great alignment is huge. Depending on the fork that you have, there's tons of different axle designs for forks. Now, EXT has opted for a hex axle on this fork. This hex axle is mainly to create strength, so you really want to make sure that the alignment of the fork tubes is perfect to make sure that that doesn't bind. My favorite style of axle is typically a floating axle that you find on any full-size dirt bike. That floating axle, there's a lot of different techniques to unbinding it. So be sure to watch some videos on how to make sure that the axle on your bike isn't bound, especially if you have a floating axle. But the most important thing is just to make sure the height of the fork legs are the same exact height on both sides. That is very, very crucial. So now that you've gone through the proper steps of installation, everything from steer tube to fork height to proper grease, now it's time to get into the nitty-gritty of the actual spring rates and how the bike should feel underneath you. Now, spring rates on these small size bikes are very tricky because most of these manufacturers, to be honest, have not taken the time to properly test and find the balance of every single one of these bikes on the market. Most of these guys take a product, they throw it on the market. What I've typically found is a 60-pound spring rate is going to be one of the better, more broad spring rates for bikes of this category. Getting up close to that number is usually good for most people that are anywhere from 130 to 180 pounds. If you're above that, you might want to go up to 65. Most of these forks, like the Fast Aces, don't even allow for any larger than a 65-pound spring rate. So spring rates in the front end, very tricky because manufacturers just have not taken the time to do proper testing. They've really just let a product go to market. That's why here at Charge, we've taken things like the Fast Ace fork, we take and we go and put custom springs and damper tunes to really try to get these products to better match your weight to balance out the bike that you're riding. But there are so many discrepancies. So that's why I am really excited to actually be testing the EXT fork on this bike, because this is an air fork. Now what that means is this fork specifically has got two different air chambers. It has got an upper chamber that makes up for pretty much 70% of your stroke, and then a lower chamber that is the remaining 30%. I love this method. Now I usually love coil over air forks. I always have. I've always thought they've performed a little bit better, or at least more reliable in most aspects. My big exception is definitely on these small size E-Motos, because this fork specifically has been done so well that you can have a ton of adjustability, and you know that if you buy this one fork, no matter what you do to your bike over time, you're able to adjust that ride height properly just because you can adjust it with air pressure. That's so crucial in a world where these things change all the time. If I go and put a different battery in this that weighs more, I just have to put some more air in the fork to get my ride height back to the right place, make sure I'm in the right portion of stroke in the travel while I'm riding. That's why I love this fork. That's why I'm so excited to test it, is because it's so adjustable over any other fork on the market. Whereas if I were to make these changes in my battery or my motor or adding weight or anything along those lines, I would have to send it in to get it revalved, get it resprung to be able to manage that weight. I don't have to do that with this fork. I can just focus on setting it up. Now that comes with the flip side of things. You want to make sure that you really take the time to set it up, because if you don't set up suspension properly, it's going to perform horribly and you're going to think that the fork is bad, when in all reality, it just hasn't been set up correctly. And trust me, when this fork is set up correctly, it's incredible. I've spent a lot of time on it. I've spent a lot of time testing it. Because I can adjust the spring rate of this fork through air chambers, I want to find a static sag zone that works really well for my suspension. So if I've got my rear end sag to about 30%, I'm usually going to find about a 20% sag rate in the front end. That's the zone that I found works really good for these small size E-Motos. Roughly that 20% mark is great for when your body weight is on the bike and you're in a neutral riding position. That is a great starting point for an actual static sag rate. Alright guys, hopefully you are still with me. I know that was a lot trying to get the bike through the installation and basic setup, but now it's time to get into what it takes to actually test and find the balance of this bike. I know you've heard me mention balance multiple times throughout this, but balance is the number one thing that I look for. I don't even think about adjusting any sort of compression or rebound until I have found the proper front to back balance of a bike. Now, starting with that static sag rate is a great place because that determines proper spring rates. That allows me to know that the bike's not going to overreact in a lot of scenarios. It's going to make it a lot easier to feel small adjustments that I make while trying to find the balance of the bike. But the first thing that I look for the moment I hop on it is I start hitting corners. Now, how the bike turns is going to be the number one thing that is the most important to me in all scenarios, because once I get the bike turning well, now I can really start to feel bumps, I can feel jumps, I can push it through any pace or any terrain that I want to, because I know that handling wise the bike is going to turn the way that I need it to. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the way that a bike balances out is different for every rider. Now, I say this because if I put out a post showing you guys my base suspension settings for the testing environment that I was in, you could very well put these suspension settings into your bike and it feel completely wrong because you didn't find the balance of your bike for yourself first. Every rider rides differently. They put their weight in different spots on the bike. The only way that my suspension setup will perfectly work for somebody else is if they are my same body weight, if they put their weight in the same spot. There's a lot of variables that come down purely to riding style that determine how a bike feels for you. So take your riding style and roll with it. let's find the balance of the bike. No matter how you ride, that's the most important number one step. And then at that point, my clicker settings might actually work for you because the bike is functioning properly underneath you, and it's coming into corners and it's accelerating out of corners within the right stance of the suspension travel, where it's sitting in dynamic sag while you're riding. If you've found balance, then you're going to be able to find harmony within the clickers from that point. So the first thing I do is try to find balance. Now, I usually start with cornering because it is the quickest way for me to determine whether my bike is balanced or not. So usually if I'm coming into a corner, and let's say I'm coming in and my front end feels like it wants to tuck. You know, I'm staying in a neutral body position, I'm coming in, the front end just wants to tuck on me, really put me into the dirt or oversteer. Typically, to me, that means my rear end is a little bit too high. So I'll usually either back off a bit of preload, or if my fork has got more adjustment, I will then change my fork height, try to really get my back end a little bit lower or my front end higher. Really whatever I feel like I've got more adjustability room in, that's what I'm going to start with adjusting. And vice versa. If I'm coming into a corner and my front end feels like it's pushing or it's not maintaining traction, then my rear end might be sagged out a little bit too much and I'm coming in with too much weight on the back of the bike. So before I go and make an adjustment, I'll come in with more weight over the front and see if I over exaggerate on the front end of the bike if it has more traction. If it does, I definitely know that my rear end is too low, and then I will go ahead and start making adjustments from there. So like I mentioned, on this bike specifically behind me, I've got 2 turns of preload on that rear shock. I like that zone. I really don't want to be messing with that at the moment. I do still have adjustability to be able to push that either direction, but the bigger thing for me is the front end of this bike is something that I definitely know is going to make a huge difference in terms of balance. So if I were to lower the fork in the triple clamp, that is going to raise my front end. Now, something that you'll typically feel is more stability at high speeds through doing something like this. If I were to raise the fork in the triple clamp, therefore lowering the front end, then the bike could typically turn quicker. Now, none of that matters if I haven't found the balance in the bike first. So I'll raise or I'll lower that front end and then I'll go back out and ride. Once I've done that, let's say the bike corners a lot better than it did before, then I'll move into going at high speed. I'll see how stable the bike is at high speed over some chattery bumps. This will determine to me if moving the front end was a good move or if I should have actually moved the rear end, because then I can feel the stability in the front end. If it feels like it's wanting to swap on me, then I've got that front end in a bad place and I need to go back to the drawing board, rebalance out the bike, and possibly adjust the rear end a little bit more to try to find that balance there. This part is tedious. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of seat time, it takes learning the bike, seeing how it feels. It's best to isolate these adjustments. So start with adjusting one thing at a time. Far too often do I see somebody go, oh, my bike's too stiff, I'm just going to adjust my compression and my rebound at the same time and get a feel for these things. It's never a good move. You always want to adjust one key component first. Now, the reason I haven't gotten into clicker adjustments yet is because they're pretty unimportant until your bike is balanced. I will say that with the caveat of, please, before you start this testing, put your clickers into a really neutral place. Typically, center them out completely. Put the dampening right in the middle on both compression and rebound, on both the fork and the shock. That's where I always start when it comes to these bikes, is right dead in the center, and then I find the balance of the bike. So once I know that the bike is cornering good, then I will move into actually hitting braking bumps and trying to start to adjust my compression and rebound dampening. Alright, we have made it towards the end of the video. Hopefully you're still with me. I know that you're probably thinking, Brett, why are we at the end of the video and we're just now getting into clicker adjustments? Truth be told, that's because clicker adjustments aren't nearly as important as all the rest of the stuff that I said. Clicker adjustments are very minor adjustments to fine-tune to the terrain that you're riding in comparison to finding the balance and harmony of your bike with the terrain. So once the bike's set up good, you've got your balance, now we're at a place where we can actually start to really get into the fine-tuning of the terrain that you are riding. Now, within clicker adjustments, there will typically be a high speed and a low speed compression, and I've even seen high and low speed rebound adjustments. Essentially, compression is the amount of force that comes through as the fork and shock compress into the ground, and then rebound is the exact opposite, the return of that back up. Let's start with rebound adjustments because in my opinion, it's typically quite a bit more important than actually compression adjustments are, because this is what determines your traction and a lot of controllability over a lot of different scenarios. Early on in my career, I always opted for a slower rebound, mainly because I started kind of more in the freeride scene. I loved hitting jumps. I didn't want the bike to overreact. When I came off of a lip face, I wanted it to be pretty slow so I knew exactly what was going to happen underneath me. The further and further along I got within racing, I definitely learned that having a higher speed rebound definitely equals more traction. Now, you can push this too far in both directions. And a really easy telltale sign that you have is if you hit chatter or big bumps or even whoops at a pretty high pace. If the bike starts kicking side to side, I've usually found that my rebound is too slow. But if it starts bucking or kicking upwards, then my rebound is too fast. So I try to find a good middle ground in between those things. But the number one thing that you are looking for when it comes to rebound adjustments is how much traction you have on the ground. Trying to keep your wheel on the ground at all times is what's so important, because it does a multitude of things, including if I hit braking bumps really quickly, the suspension won't pack up on itself. And what I mean by that is as I keep going over these braking bumps, the suspension won't keep going further and further into the compression and becoming harsher and harsher as I go through that. It will actually return fast enough to maintain this dynamic ride height and stay through those braking bumps as I hit them. So once I've found an okay spot for my rebound adjustment, I will move into compression. Now, like I said, there's high and low speed compressions. Some forks only have one set of compression. They don't have the dual circuits, which is actually a lot easier to manage and to tune. But high speed compression is essentially how much force comes into the fork at a high speed. So if I hit a whoop, or if I hit a log, or if I hit anything of the nature that throws a spike of a lot of force into my bike, that is high speed compression. Low speed compression are these forces that come at a much slower pace. So if I'm rolling over whoops, then that's usually going to be low speed compression because it's not going fast. It is not being super reactive. If I'm going to hit a jump and I'm going up the face and my suspension is loading, that usually happens pretty slowly. That's a nice low speed compression zone. However, if I go to land a jump, then I'm landing and it's putting a lot of force through that moves into high speed compression, right? So when it comes to compression, it is all about support. You want to have an appropriate amount of support for anything that you're going through. If I hit a big jump, I want to be able to have that suspension travel. I want to be able to go through it. I want to not bottom out every time I land. Having that support's great. But when I'm going through braking bumps and things that aren't going to push me all the way through my suspension travel, I don't want it to be harsh on that upper end. I want to be able to use that suspension. It's good to use suspension. It is there for a reason. You definitely want to be able to use as much suspension travel as possible and then leave the last little bit, I would say last 20-30% of your suspension travel to those big hits. That's how you know you're in a really good compression zone, is if you're using a lot of your suspension travel through most of the riding, but you still have the support when it comes to hitting big bumps. Once I find good support in my compression and I find good traction in my rebound, now if I'm on a track or I'm in different scenarios and I'm trying to make adjustments to match that terrain, typically I won't have to make very many clicks of adjustments. So like let's say, I had great support this day at this track, but now I'm riding something like really choppy and it's feeling a little bit harsh. I want it to soften up. Maybe I'll back off my compression clickers. Let's say I back them off 4 clicks. If I do that, it's important, especially on suspension setups that don't have check valves, to actually adjust your rebound at the same time. So if I go out on compression, I'm going to go in on rebound. That way I find this harmony within that damper, and vice versa. If I go in on compression, I'm going to come out on rebound. You'll notice this keeps the bike tracking well in most scenarios. This harmony that you found in previous testing needs to be maintained, and on suspension without a check valve, that's one great way to maintain that. I know that this is a lot of information, and I can keep going on and on and on about it, but if you guys have any questions, please comment below. There's so many different factors that go into suspension tuning. I know it can be quite daunting, but I really hope this video helped you guys learn a thing or two, and it helps you guys to ultimately get your suspension set up, because I know how frustrating it can be to go and spend a bunch of money on a bike and just not have it feel right. It's very important to take the time to get it set up properly for your own riding style. Every rider's different. I hope these tips and tricks definitely help you guys to be able to get out there and get your bike set up for you. I also want to give a huge shout out to Cirrus Suspension. A lot of my knowledge has definitely been refined over the years with tuning sessions that I've done with these guys. Cirrus has also brought out tuners from Andriani USA, who's an incredible suspension company. They're my go-to for any of my gas dirt bikes at getting my suspension set up for my riding style. Between the help of those guys, I have really learned a lot about suspension over the last couple of years, and it has made me such a better rider and given me so much more feel when I'm on a bike. Huge thank you to Cirrus, huge thank you to Andriani USA, and EXT as well for creating such good products that are really there with the primary focus of making a rider feel comfortable and confident on the machine.